just today, we had somebody give a talk, Mickey Inslick from University of Toronto. He gave a talk, and it was about effort. So one of the things that he studies is just under what conditions people exert more effort and whatever. And you want to say that things like that really are as close to controllable as possible. Like, what it means to have effort is that you've exerted some sort of intent. You're doing something intentional in order to make a change. It's I do think that once there's intuition, like the law does a great job of this. Look, there's some things you intended and some things you didn't, and people don't disagree that much. It does seem, though, that maybe we can say the things that you for sure had no control over, but it really becomes hard to say the things that you for sure did have control over.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's an interesting ambiguity in Cohen's view here, because I think that depending on how you read it, that might be a pretty big problem for applying this, or it might not be that big. So I think that, like, there are some places here where he almost seems to suggest this like really strong reading of this equality of opportunity principle, where like as long as it was up to you, you like have a right to the extra stuff, right? And if that's how you read it, then yeah, I think what you're saying is actually a pretty big problem for the view potentially, or at least for figuring out what the view entails in practice. But I think there's also just a purely negative reading of it, which I think would probably make more sense. I mean, I'm not certain which one he intends. I think that the negative one makes more sense in more things he says, but that's all I'll say about it, right? So the purely negative reading is just like, the equality of opportunity principle doesn't tell you which inequalities you should have. It only tells you which inequalities you can't have, right? That you can't have inequalities that trace back to things that are outside of people's control, and that because he even says, like, I should say for people who haven't who shamefully have not read this book yet, you should probably pause the video and go read it and come back, but
it'll take you half an hour.
It's very well written. Like, I had never read it.
It's very well written. It's also very short, so yes, it's not gonna really delay your bedtime that much. But if you because the reason I think that the negative reading probably makes sense of more things that he says is that he also does say that some inequalities that pass muster from socialist inequality of opportunity are still morally objectionable for other reasons.
That's right. Yeah, it's for community reasons, right? Yeah.
Yeah, which is a little bit, which is a little bit under specified what that means. But I mean, I think roughly the intuition is something like, okay, we could definitely think of cases where you are at the bottom end of an inequality and it really was because of something that's under your control, right? Like you just took some crazy gamble and you just lost big, or even you took a gamble that was rationally worth it, but you lost big. And you lost so big that you're just doing dramatically worse than the people who didn't do this, that they're making 10 times what you are, they're
I have an example from my real life. A lot of my friends went and got jobs at business schools. And so the first few years when we'd meet up at conferences and we'd go out to dinner, they would split the fucking bill. And I'd be like, you guys, you make an order of magnitude more than me. Here was it was a choice I made. Sure, of course it was a choice I made. But community, kick in for my drinks.
Yeah. So basically, the intuition seems to be something like, look, it might there might be cases of extreme inequalities that really are not you have $100 more in your bank account than I do, but you have 10 times as much in your bank account as I do, that it might trace back to a free choice, but also it seems to show a callous level of indifference to the bottom end of that inequality if we let it grow to that point. So even though it doesn't violate socialist equality of opportunity, we still have some other kind of moral reason to want to like rein it in. And that to me suggests that it's primarily negative. Like you shouldn't have inequalities that are due to stuff outside of your control, which, I mean, to give it its due, I mean, like I think is not an uncommon moral intuition. I mean, I think that that this is like certainly I mean, like a lot of what Rawls says is based on something, at least in the neighborhood of this, right? That he thinks that like there's something obviously morally objectionable. At least, it could be out for Rawls, it could be outweighed by other considerations, but there's something at least somewhat morally objectionable about having people have benefits that are due to factors outside of their control. That seems to have something to do, like it's plausible that has something to do with why we don't like the idea of like slavery and feudalism and apartheid and caste systems and all that stuff, because like there's nothing you can do about it. It's outside of your hands.
Yeah.
In reading this, I was curious as to what Cohen meant by community and the distinction that he was making between, he's like, look, it's not a violation of justice to have this kind of inequality. Arguably, it sounded to me like what he was saying is, but you're kind of a dick if you want a society where that happens. And I wasn't clear if he was making. It's only now that you guys said that it's another kind of moral reason. But I thought that what he was saying was like, doesn't have the moral pull of justice, but all things considered, you're a dick if you think that that's okay. But I guess that's a moral reason. I wasn't sure what moral status community had. I
thought it was on par. Like I thought, if I remember, so I just read this just now, like you did. So, but from what I remembered, I thought it was that there were two components to the socialist conception of justice, and one was the equality of opportunity, and the other was community. And so that was my reading of it, and that these things can maybe be in tension, and they can maybe put limits on each other. But I thought community was up there in importance with equality of opportunity.
Yeah, I should say too, I think it's probably going to also work the other way around, right? That there are things that don't necessarily. So again, I think community is a little vague. I think he's much more precise about what he means by social equality of opportunity. But he sort of like gives these kinds of examples about like, the ways that it's hard to, that like it doesn't really seem like you're treating other people as members of your community if you allow them to like have like just dramatically less than you do, and I think it's a little bit confusing because the way he uses the word justice is I think like there are passages in this book where he sort of uses justice just to mean equality, but I think a fair reading of what he means is that it's morally objectionable to structure a society, which I would normally parse that as it would be unjust to violate either one of these, and that there are probably going to be ways that, like Ryan said, both constrain the other. That like you have that there are probably going to be inequality. Like you could have very minor inequalities, right? Like if I, if you and I are working at the same job and there's some promotion where the promotion doesn't come with very much more money at all. It comes with like 1% more money. But also I only get the promotion because of nepotism, then presumably that doesn't violate community because it's not a big enough inequality to make it seem like you're not being treated as a member of the community, but it would violate, any version of equality of opportunity, but certainly socialist equality of opportunity, because that's outside of your hands. So it seems to me that the view is that both of these things do work of like ruling out certain kinds of inequalities the other one might not rule out. And I know it's also a little weird that he has two of them, but I think that as far as I can tell, the idea is something like this, that like, okay, you have this intuition that equality is really important, but does that actually mean that it would be like horribly morally objectionable anytime anybody has like anything that anybody else doesn't? That seems crazy, right? I mean, I always think of like the scene in Casino where Robert De Niro like storms back to the kitchen to like say, there have to be exactly as many blueberries in every muffin, right? Clearly, if you have fewer blueberries in your muffin, that's not a moral crisis, right? So it says, okay, well, there must be like more specific reasons why we object to like different kinds of inequalities, and these seem like two plausible reasons. Definitely not the only ones, actually, but these seem like at least two big important reasons why we would object to certain inequalities.
Yeah. I think that sounds right. So another thing, getting back kind of to the topic, like what are maybe the implications of these views of free will for justice?
I did want to just really quickly interject, Ryan, because I'm really curious about your view on this. It seems like one way that you could object to the way that Cohen is connecting these two topics, and I just have no idea what I think about this, is like, you could question whether the kind of control that intuitively matters for justice is actually the same kind of control that matters for moral responsibility, because he seems to be assuming that they are, and
So that's exactly the question I was going to raise. That's right. So I think at least there's an argument you don't need to. And again, so I think maybe it would have just been better, as much as it is a delightful passage, but the book could have just done without it. Because even a lot of, again, going back to like say Caruso or Parabon, like Caruso in his most recent book that I read, Rejecting Retributivism, he defends an account of social justice. And he even explicitly says, like, when it comes to questions of social justice, a lot of the distinctions compatibilists make are useful. The kinds of control, so those kinds of just like control that you can have even if determinism is true, and that you might lack even if determinism is true. Like those distinctions compatibilists have carved out are useful for questions of social justice. So like he defends what he calls, and I think he's borrowing this from like Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, like he calls it a capabilities approach to social justice. So where social justice is about making sure we have the opportunities to develop basic human capacities, like autonomy and security and and reasoning and health and things like that. And he's explicit, the kind of autonomy he's talking about is just a compatibilist sense of autonomy. So he thinks this isn't enough to ground moral responsibility, but it's still important to make sure that society gives us that kind of autonomy. And so Cohen could just say, this is all I need for could do the same thing. It's just, this is all I need. We need to, socialist equality of opportunity would require respecting choices that are autonomous in the compatibilist sense without thinking that this means anyone deserves in a deep moral sense more than others. And that can also be constrained by community and other considerations too.
Yeah. So it occurs to me that like we've kind of been spending this whole time like sort of referring to like kinds of control that compatibilists think are important, or control or free will in compatibilist sense, without ever actually having said very much about what that means. So so
I think that was the question too that was raised. Like what do you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I'm not qualified to answer. So go ahead, Ryan or Ben.
No, Ryan. Tell us what kind of free will we need for moral responsibility. Is 10 seconds or less.
Well, we need to have a magic thing in our brains that can deviate from the causal laws.
The quantum module.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Spend longer and say something that might be true.
Okay. So here's the kind of stuff compatibilists talk about, and again, this is the kind of stuff that even Caruso agrees is important. He just thinks it's not enough to get us all the way to moral responsibility. So like, I'll give two. Like one classic one comes from Harry Frankfurt. So Harry Frankfurt thought the kind of control we need for moral responsibility is the ability to act on second-order desires. So he draws this distinction between first-order desires, which are desires for like specific courses of actions, like a desire to go to the movies or a desire to get high or eat food or whatever. And then there are second-order desires, which are not desires for actions, but desires to have particular first-order desires either be effective or not be effective, like either lead us to action or not lead us to action. And so for him, like having the kind of control that is he thinks necessary and sufficient for moral responsibility is to sort of have our wills be unified, to be able to, at the second order level, determine at least somewhat effectively which of our first order desires are actually going to lead us to action. So like if I had a reason not to go to the movies, like say I have to, I have an exam in the morning, so I shouldn't go to the movies, then I could, even though I still have the desire to go to the movies, I can reflect on that desire and not have that desire lead me to go to the movies. And so that kind of reflective control over our actions is something we could have, even if in an ultimate sense, we were causally determined.
Yeah, so like Frankfurt has this paper, the free will and the concept of a person, where he says that like one of the things we really want out of an idea of what free will is that it be something that differentiates us from cognitively simpler animals who, which is certainly not going to be like, okay, that they do things because they want to do them, because I mean, my dog does that, all the time, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure practically everything she does because she wants to do it. So
that's right.
This chew toy looks great, whatever. But presumably, if you think there's an important difference, that like so like Frankfurt thinks it has to be something beyond that, and so like one candidate for something that we can do that gives us a kind of control over our actions that other animals don't have is that we can reflect on our desires and think about whether we want to have them at all, think about whether we want to act on them, all that stuff.
Yeah, and this also gives them a nice way to account for like weakness of will too, because like sometimes you might have the second order desire that says, I shouldn't go to the movies, but if you're like me, you might be so weak-willed that you just go to the movies anyway. And you're like, screw it, I'll just wake up in the morning and study. Okay, kind of thing I always did in school. But yeah,
I always wondered if Frankfurt would, like if he believed that there are aliens with fifth order desires that are that much more free than we are.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that he's touched on that.
They can reflect on whether when they reflect on their third order desires.
It's meta desires all the way down.
Yeah. I have the desire to have the desire to have the desire to go to the movie, but I don't have the desire to have the desire to have the desire to have the desire to go. Yeah. And to really have all five of those levels in line. There you go.
That's right.
All right. So you said you were going to give us two. That's one.
Okay. So the other one is John Martin Fisher, which is sort of similar, but not necessarily depending on the hierarchy. But his basic account of freedom is that we're free as long as our behavior is guided by mechanisms that are in the brain that are both reactive to and receptive to reasons, especially moral reasons. So being receptive to is you understand moral reasons, you care about moral reasons, and being reactive to is you at least to a degree are able to guide your behavior by moral reasons. So it doesn't require to have it perfectly, because of course sometimes we're going to fail to do that. But as long as you're what he calls moderately reasons responsive, and especially with moral reasons, which means you can somewhat reliably guide your behavior by moral reasons, then you have the kind of control necessary to ground moral responsibility.
Yeah. So,
Ryan, which convinces you? What's your belief about this?
I like the Frankfurt account quite a bit. So that's in my dissertation. I try to refine and defend a version of Frankfurt or the Fisher's account. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know, David, I mean, that the hierarchical thing is something that you found interested in, and like sort of was part of like academic work you did on like the psychology of moral judgment.
Yeah. No, I love that account. And as with a lot of work by moral philosophers, I always just thought that there were just some very keen observations about the psychology of the whole thing. And one of the things that I did for my dissertation actually was I didn't know I was stealing this idea from Susan Wolf, but it turns out that I was. But it was on the asymmetry of the requirements for blaming and for praising.
Yeah.
And so I did studies showing that people do in fact think that, like, if you did something super impulsively, like first order desire,
Mm-hmm.
you get less blame for it than if you really intended it and calmly
Mm-hmm.
punch someone in the face. But people don't seem to think that for praise, at least in the examples that I used, where nobody really says, or nobody really says like, oh, well, I mean, I know the reason you gave that homeless man all the money in your wallet is just because you were under extreme sympathy, and you can't be praised for that. Nobody really says that. In fact, people almost seem to think the opposite, that if you have that kind of emotion, then you're good. And what I did with the Frankfurt stuff is use it as a framework to understand why people were making these judgments, and I tried to show that what people are doing is they're making an inference that if you did something negative due to an impulse or a passion or something that you wouldn't want, in a calmer situation, you would reject that desire. You would say, I wish I hadn't lost my cool. And people don't say that for positive things. They say they think that you would embrace the desire to be a sympathetic person. And so it's that rejection, the second order rejection, that is what's driving this effect. And sure enough, if you tell people, I mean, this might be obvious, but if you tell people, the person gave all their money to the homeless guy on the street because they had such overwhelming sympathy. However, they wish that they weren't that kind of person. Then people do reduce their praise. So I always thought, like, it seemed to capture a way in which we really do think about people's wills.
Oh, that's really cool to know that there's like some empirical support for the stuff these philosophers were making up. So that's
right.
That's cool. Very cool. Yeah. And so then to get back to the Cohen thing, so I think Cohen could just say like Caruso and other people do, that like, look, all we need to talk about is the kind of control, this kind of control. We don't have to worry about whether or not this is enough to get us all the way to moral responsibility. This kind of control can still be relevant for questions of justice.
Yeah, right. So this is what I was wondering. This is one of the things I was thinking about when I said this would be an interesting thing to talk about, because I am very unclear in my own head how much these, like, the way that you'd have to control your actions to be morally responsible overlaps, with the, like, when we have these moral intuitions, like it's wrong to like blame people for things that are outside, no, that was a moral responsibility one. Let me rephrase. It's wrong to, it's wrong for people to have worse outcomes because of stuff that's not in their control, right? That they were like, are those the same? Like, is the kind of control that would matter for one the kind of control that matters for the other? And I honestly have no idea. I mean, it sort of sounds like it might be, but it also sort of sounds like not crazily implausible that those are just two different things.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they're two different things either, but I do think, I mean, one. So I'll say, I mean, I actually, even though I'm not a skeptic, I do have a lot of respect for some of the arguments they make. So one of the things Caruso says that does resonate with me is, and one of his arguments against, especially like using retributivism in criminal justice. So one of his arguments is that we should have a really high epistemic standard before we're going to apply notions of desert to justify like really harming people, like really doing serious harm to people. So he has other arguments against compatibilism, but he says, even if you're not convinced by those arguments, you shouldn't be so sure of compatibilism that you're going to use it to justify like throwing someone in horrible conditions in prison for 50 years. So I do think, like, at least I thought I've been attracted to recently is there might be like a kind of contextualism about when we're going to allow compatibilists to justify behaviors and not. And like when it comes to state level.
So I should just probably pause for just half a second to say, contextualism. I mean, I think that's what you're talking about is the view that like the sort of like simple, like the sort of like really common examples are like, when does the bank close? It closes at 5:30. Do you know that? Yeah, I know. wait a second, if we don't get to the bank today, we're not going to be able to go for 2 weeks, and we're not going to pay our rent, and we're going to be in serious trouble. Now, do you know that it's closing at 5:30? It's like, I guess maybe I don't know, right? Like
it's a parallel to that.
What the standards are for knowledge, depends on how high the stakes are, and so that it would be something roughly parallel to that.
Yeah, something similar to that. So like when the context is like, justifying state sanctioned, like severe consequences for people, then the standards are probably higher. We should probably, we should at least see how far we can get without appealing to moral responsibility and compatibilism, and see how much we can justify, the way Caruso and other people do. And then maybe in like more personal context, like when it comes to relationships with people who have wronged you, then it's more like, just getting to the bank to get money for going to the bar rather than to pay rent, right, or whatever. Then in those lower stake contexts, then I think we're more justified in acting on compatibilist standards. I think the arguments are strong enough there, or at least that's the idea I'm attracted to lately. Yeah.
So it might be the case that, say, a personality disorder is enough to not want to like in a state sanctioned way, punish somebody for something.
Yeah.
But it might be enough to make you angry at the person.
Yeah. I might
like
still,
if
they're my friend and they really wronged me in something, then I might say I think the arguments for compatibilists are strong enough to justify me being angry and maybe even giving them some consequences, like I'm not going to talk to you now, right, or something.
Right.
But not enough. But the arguments maybe are, at least there's enough uncertainty about the arguments, and the stakes are so high when we're talking about throwing you in jail or whatever. That we should then maybe just have a little more humility at that level.
Right. I have a question. Just it might take us too far afield, and if so, Ben, just pop in. But has anybody expressed the worry that if you're a determinist, incompatibilist, so you believe nobody is morally responsible, if you combine that with our sort of propensity to still want to hold people accountable for some cases, that what you might be giving up is clear rules to regulate when you're going to. So it seems like the compatibilist at least has to come up with some rules. But if I really am a determinist, I might, given the psychology, be more willy-nilly about when I blame and when I don't.
Yeah, because you could, especially if you said the kinds of things I have heard people say. It's like, look, sure, Strawson's right that, P.F. Strawson, that it's just like a psychological fact that we can't get rid of these attitudes, but whatever. I mean, that doesn't mean that they track anything that really exists. And if you say that, then like, all right, if you're already resigned to being irrational, then like,
right,
then like it seems like you that might make you less likely to be, wait a second, I'm being unreasonable. I shouldn't get mad at this guy right now.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I mean, I think that's an important worry. I do think skeptics try to deal with that. Like I know going back to Perbaum and like Caruso, like, and Waller and some other moral responsibility skeptics, like what they'll usually try to, and the thing that gets interesting to me is as they start to make these moves, like they get closer and closer to just being compatibilist. But like one of the things they'll do, and that's
I have to say, actually, a few years ago, Paraboom gave a talk at Rutgers, and I think I remember messaging you that it's like I'm getting really confused about why what he's saying now isn't just compatibilism.
Yeah. No, he like his later work just became more and more compatibilist. Same with Waller, and I think even same with Caruso. Like the more they refine their views to deal with these objections, the more it's like, well, yeah, just a few steps further and you're with me now. Like we're here. Like, yeah.
By the way, Sam Harris, who has, as we all probably know, views that about free will that maybe aren't I'm not gonna say too much, but
I know he's a friend of yours, so I don't.
He's a friend, but he's just a compatibilist, and he's just a free will denier. But he's actually a compatibilist, like he's.
He's absolutely. At least about responsibility, he's absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know actually. Like I don't know that I believe that. I think that like. At least in terms of what he says in his book about free will, I think that like he uses phrases that make it sound like he's actually a compatibilist about moral responsibility. Like he actually uses the phrase moral responsibility, but then when he describes his view in detail, it sounds like a less worked out, let's say. I think going with Thumper's mother's rule. I think I'll just put it like that. But it sounds like a less worked out version of what like classic Paraboom thinks, right? You know, that's like, oh, you know, nothing that anybody does is really their fault, but you should still punish them, you know, for like the same reason we quarantine plague victims, that, you know, they don't deserve to be quarantined, but it's like good for public safety. Which, you know, I actually, by the way, is another place that I think that the debate might have political valence that's different from what people usually think it does, because like I think that one of my big worries about this, it's not a reason to think it's not true, but one of my big worries about this is that it's going to be very hard to make sense of like really hardcore intuitions about the rights of defendants if you think it's just this sort of pragmatic thing. But anyway, but like I don't see a lot of gap between Harris and Paraboom on that.
No, I think you're right in some of what he says. So I guess I really think like his little free will book sounds super compatibilist, but I think you're right. Some of the stuff he says later, like he tries to be more nuanced about it. But then the other, like, I mean, I haven't listened to his podcast in a while. I'll try not to be too mean here, since I know we're talking about Dave's friend.
But to be fair, he purposefully doesn't engage in some of the literature because he doesn't think it's important. So for whatever it's worth, it's not as if we're telling him something that he wouldn't endorse.
That's true.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I think he should be more careful about it. But I mean, one of the reasons I stopped listening to his podcast is because he at least for a while, maybe he doesn't do this now, but at least for a while, he was getting very, like, all of his opening segments were like super defensive and angry and righteous about the way people were treating him and talking about him. So he's displaying a lot of really robust reactive attitudes in these opening segments, especially for a guy who's like, oh, like meditation has like made me super calm and whatever. But anyway, yeah. So I just think I guess this kind of goes to Cohen's point, like you can't really be a skeptic, like it's not in the way you live your life.
Which I feel bad now. We should trash some of our friends. Mark Warren really sucks.
Yeah, that Mark guy in the chat there. I mean, man.
Yeah.
I feel like I popped us down 2 stacks, and I don't actually I don't know where I derailed you, but Ryan, I think you had a train of thought.
I forgot what train of thought I had.
Yeah, so I will just say, going back to what Ryan was saying about Caruso, and the Caruso's like argument that if you're not super duper sure about that people are morally responsible, you know, you shouldn't assume it in these really, really high stakes situation, like, you know, killing people or putting them in jail or, you know, whatnot. And I was thinking about how that intersects with our original subject, you know, the Cohen book and Cohen's, you know, socialist equality of opportunity point, because I think you could actually adopt that Caruso argument and agree with Cohen's larger point, and even agree that the kind of control that matters would also be the one that matters for moral responsibility. I think you could actually believe all three of those things if you read socialist equality of opportunity in a purely negative way, right? That it's not telling you anything about which inequalities are justified. It's only telling you which equalities definitely aren't justified.
I think that's right.
Yeah, because you could
that sounds plausible.
Yeah, you could just say, look, we're sure that you're not in control of X, Y, and Z. Therefore, it's clearly unjust to have inequalities that trace back to X, Y, and Z. Are you in control of any of this other stuff? Hard to say, right? But like then again, like, creating a more equal society is really difficult anyway, right? So it's like, we can at least work on X, Y, and Z first.
Yeah, that's right.
While we figure out if you're in control of any of the rest of this stuff, which like it's, I mean, not to undersell the radicalism here. I mean, like there are a lot of things that we can be pretty sure that people aren't in control of. That like doing away with those inequalities would just involve like fundamental changes to our like I think one thing we can all agree on is that you're not in control of who your dad is.
Yeah,
without a time machine.
So like that already gets you abolishing inheritance, right? So
right. Yeah, but God is. He made me have this money, or like lead in the water. Okay, so can I ask this question about Fisher's reasons? Is Fisher right? The reasons responsiveness.
Yeah, John Martin Fisher. Yeah.
Is if you are born with a higher IQ, which I think you can be for what it's worth.
Yes.
Are you and you might be more reasons responsive, right? In a way, but you actually have zero control over how reasons responsive you are.
Yeah.
So he doesn't need it. He doesn't need reasons responsive itself to be under.
Well, I think the distinction here is that it doesn't like. I think it's consistent to say that some things are your fault because you're sufficiently reasons responsive about, like in other words, this decision was made using mechanisms in your brain that are sufficiently responsive to reasons. That this thing is your fault, but it's not your fault that you're the sort of being who sometimes is at fault. That sentence went in a weird place, but I think I'm making the right distinction.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah. So it's a matter of luck whether you get this capacity or not.
Right.
But for those people who have the capacity, and like for him and for a lot of compatibilists, like the kind of like more responsibility is like a threshold concept. Yeah. So like once like your IQ or your whatever, your reasons responsiveness is up to once it's past a certain threshold, then you're responsive enough to be held morally responsible for your actions. And some people unluckily will not have that and they won't be blameworthy. Right. And some people luckily will have it and they can't be, like Britt said, they can't be praised for having the capacity, but they can be praised or blamed for what they do with those capacities.
Right. It's a matter of luck. Well, and I mean, I think this is like pretty commonsensical. It's a matter of luck whether you have the cognitive threshold that like we think that like you can make your own decisions and and things can be your fault and all of that stuff. People, uncontroversial cases of people who aren't responsible for their decisions. We don't think that's their fault.
Yeah.
But we don't think it's a matter of luck that you made this given decision, given that you are the kind of person who has these
makes sense. Yeah. Has to stop somewhere. Has to stop.
Yeah. I should also say, by the way, David, that little I want to wrap up, but I mean that little comment you made in passing about IQ, I think this is another place where there's an interesting way that the moral or political valence of the debate is not always what it might first appear to be, right? Because I think there's a sort of very common belief that if you accept that, I mean, whatever you think, IQ is a very imperfect measurement of any of this or whatever, but like there are certain kinds of cognitive skills and abilities, right? That if how much of those you have, like, I think a lot of people think that if you think how much of those you have is to a great extent innate, then that means that like, it's, I don't know, people who are on the bottom end of certain inequalities, that's just as it should be and, whatever. But I mean, I think it's the opposite, right? That if it's not under your control, whether you have these skills, then it's crazy to say that you should be greatly economically rewarded for having them.
Yeah.
It makes me, in reading this book, I think that there is some insight there in the community criteria that Cohen lays out that did help me distinguish between what it might be that people who are more on the right or maybe libertarian don't care about. That it seems as if community, say for a libertarian, is just, it's not something they would endorse as a criterion for I don't know, for whatever, for a fair society or for good. seems a very lefty kind of thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think that at the very least, I think that like the more you emphasize it, the less likely you are to be something like a hardcore libertarian. You know, that like I'm sure there are lots of moderate libertarians who do like, you know, look, I've had many libertarians tell me, we'll argue about politics. Look, I'm not saying we should let people starve in the streets. Right. So like that's clearly, you know,
how good of them. Yeah.
It's a big concession, right? You know, it's like, I guess I'll draw the line at starving.
Yeah. No, I'm not going to argue that, but I will let it happen. I'm just not going to argue it. No, it's okay. Some of my best friends are libertarians.
Yeah, I mean, I would go so far as best friends, but I have friends who are libertarians.
They're incapable of friendship, is what you're saying.
They're just second level friends.
Some of the people I tolerate are libertarians.
Yeah, just I was just trying to think if I just really offended anybody. I don't think so, but yeah, like I think that there are like, you know, and there are libertarians who think like you can have just a little bit of community as a treat, you know, but I think that like if you think this is like a really fundamental principle that should shape how society should work, you're almost certainly not going to end up in a libertarian place.
Right.
All right. This was really fun, guys. We should do it again.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
this is super fun.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.